Welcome to this wonderful event in the Red Wheelbarrow. Is it better to leave it open? Or? A little bit. Yeah, a little bit there. Yeah, great. Cole?
Yes. Oui,
Can I have
on
your
va parler
attention,
fort.
please?
Elle me dit qu'il faut parler fort.
Right.
Parce qu'elle a peur qu'à mon âge, je ne suis plus capable de... Ça va là-haut, vous m'entendez? Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
And,
There's a chair here.
and
Chair here. This is Murphy's Law. There's a chair right here, a chair here, a chair here. And there's the beautiful, those are the best seats in the house. All right, welcome to the Red Wheelbarrow Bookstore. Could I have a round of applause, please, for the wonderful Jana, who is the publisher of this book. And of course, we have some very famous people here, and I will leave it up to you to introduce everyone, who everybody knows who they are already, but it's always wonderful. This is particularly a lovely event because with the rise of fascism, this is a very appropriate book, and also, as some of you probably know, this used to be a fascist bookstore, but they had to move out last year because they, you know.
There were several bookstores, and it's a long story. Not only fascist.
No, not only, and it's going back to being.
No,
there was
Corti,
who was in the resistance.
et la livre et Blanchard.
Yes, absolutely, and he's quite right. We painted over.
They weren't as nice as us.
Yeah. Anyway, a round of applause.
Well, thank you so much, Penelope and Natasha, for hosting this event. So
Louder.
and obviously, so I guess I don't need to introduce Étienne Balibar, who was my professor at Columbia and is also a friend, and he says that I'm his favorite enemy. No, you said
that?
Yeah, in Prague you said that.
Oh.
So Étienne, a philosopher, and on here Vincent Jacques, another philosopher teaching at the architecture school in Versailles, and an expert on Prismarker and Deleuze. And I'm Jana Ndiaye Berankova, and I run this little publishing house called Édition Suture, or Suture Press. We do very few books, but we try to make them well. You might notice that Suture is a bit of a pun on Lacan and Badiou, but also the actual material stitching of the book. And today, we're here to actually talk about this book, which we published. I mean, it's been a while. I kind of almost forgot this book because we were editing it during the pandemic, so we never really had a proper book launch. But this book actually comes from this conference that we organized, I think it was 2018 in Prague, along with different institutions, and we invited Jacques to Prague. And it was a conference on the philosophical heritage of May '68 and the Prague Spring. So in fact, if you see the graphic design, it's called Prague Paris. And there was a bit of a joke at that moment, because in '89 there was this famous poster, and this is actually the graphic design kind of retakes the poster, kind of reversing the '68 and '89, saying that the '89 Velvet Revolution is just the inverted Prague Spring of '68.
We'll discuss that.
We'll discuss that. But that's basically where the book came from. But then the book kind of morphed into an autonomous project. So, the authors in the book are not totally the same. And we added our friend Étienne, who wrote a very...
I wasn't there at the conference.
Yeah. No.
As my friend Alain Badiou, who is a friend of yours as well, once told me, we exchange frequently these kinds of niceties. He said, you were never there when something real or impressive happened.
But you are in the book.
It's just a small attempt at coping, catching up. But I wasn't there, that's true.
So we're gonna talk about this book, but I'm also, if you want to stay in touch with Suture, I'm gonna just circulate a sheet of paper. If you want to leave us your email, we have a mailing list so that you know what we do. And I'm going to just briefly show you, before we start actually talking philosophy, I'm gonna show you, this is a book we just published in French, because we do books in French and English. It's called L'éclat de l'absolu. This was like a 10-year project with
Is there?
So 10-year project of my, well, actually 5 years of interviews, 2014 to 2019, with Alain Badiou, the philosopher, and the book has these like very lovely kind of drawings inspired by French encyclopedia and the Baroque engravings, kind of subverting some of the, some of the classicist aspect of Badiou, but we're not going to talk about Badiou, don't worry. But have a look at this book. We just published it. We actually launched it at Read Hall a week ago. And you might also see our little, this is a very successful book, Silver, Sometimes We Are Eternal, which is a quip on Spinoza, one scholar of Spinoza. This little book also with some kind of nice papers, Alain Badiou. And you might see there's a very big volume, which was probably our biggest book so far we did, called Archives of the Sun, Archives du Soleil. And this is a monograph of an artist, who's actually my husband, by the way, and who does these like paintings of African movie theaters. And it has text by Mancha Javara, who's an expert on African film, Badiou, Vincent wrote a piece, myself, and a curator from Tate Modern and Centre Pompidou contributed. And it has those two kinds of paper, and all these like oil paintings from Africa. So you can have a look at this in the bookshop.
I'm not there.
No, sorry.
I couldn't.
But so today,
But I admire it. Both the book and the subject.
oh, I think the pen is lost. Maybe.
There's a plan.
There's
Just
there's
take
a
mine.
piece we
I know if I'm gonna take notes, but don't worry. So, well, but back to the topic I wanted to talk about today with you, Étienne. And by the way, one joke, one personal, very personal detail on this book, this book actually includes kind of collages made from, the tracts of May '68 and Czechoslovak posters.
Yes.
And a very personal detail, this is actually, this collage, I did them at the time myself when we were doing the book, sort of collaborating with a graphic designer. And actually this collage, it's a photo that my grandmother took when the troops of the Warsaw Pact occupied, Prague. So I kind of accidentally found it in
Which street or?
Vinohradska. That's where the radio is, because my grandparents used to live there. So I kind of integrated it in the collages.
It's your history.
Yeah. But so about the book, well, the book actually includes a set of paper, and I would like to just start with my first question or comment that's linked to actually the paper which introduces this book, and it's a text by Jacques, another well-known philosopher, when he describes the actually May '68 as a kind of a conflict between what he calls the police logic, according to which political action would be just sort of seen as an equilibrium of forces composing society, and this kind of political conflict could be always kind of resolved by rebalancing those forces within the society on the one side, and on the other side, the idea that actually political activity possesses its own autonomous rationality, namely that politics is a work of subjects, is defined by their acts, And actually, political subjectivation as such is short-circuiting the order of social relationships. And at the beginning of this book, actually, Jacques Rancière writes something saying that the events of May 68 contradicted the sociological vision of the world, namely the vision in which every kind of member of the society or every social class is on their place and are kind of being controlled within this kind of equilibrium. And so I wanted to ask you, Étienne, if you think that, what do you think about this interpretation of May 68?
Try.
You're not buying into it.
No. There is something in that interpretation that I completely agree with. But
So?
I think, Jana, don't rush me. I use 30 minutes. So this is dangerous. Can you hear me? Yes.
No.
Okay. Jana told me you will have 15 minutes. So after 15 minutes, boom, cut me wherever I have a right. And I will even do something crazy, which will already, excuse me, my English is rotten, already eat some of these minutes. Because since 68 is the subject, and since we're here in this beautiful bookstore, that is 50 meters or 100 perhaps from the Odeon Theatre that you see here, it's impossible for me not to remember and recall a very, I think, funny and revealing anecdote from 68. So during, I would not be, don't be afraid, I will not make any attempt at telling what 68 has been in detail. I guess you have some idea in mind. And among the ideas you have in mind, which are of course exact, is the fact that there was a students' uprising, so confronted the police. It's very interesting to ask why there have been casualties, there have been people, students who are wounded, perhaps cops as well, but no death, which was extremely surprising because the police used very violent, very brutal instruments. I'm not going to details. So you had barricades, of course, but these were real barricades. I mean, of course, a barricade is also a symbolic monument, so to speak, object. And to erect barricades in the center of Paris is a way of returning, and Rancière would not disagree with that, to invoke and to reenact a whole mythology, I would say, but that mythology is history. I mean, that is the succession of 19th century uprisings, workers and others in the center of Paris. So 1848, to which I will return if I have time, the Paris Commune, etc., etc. So the barricades in Rue de Médicis, which is just opposite there, or in Boulevard Saint-Michel, they cut the trees, and were not like the barricades from the Commune. They were quickly dismantled, but on the barricades there was fight with the police, and the police used grenades and things like that. So why no death? It's one of the most interesting. It's not sociological, but it's also not political in Rancière's sense. It's too material, to be political in his sense. So it has to do with the personality of the chief of the Paris police in 68, a man called Maurice Grimaud. He's an extremely interesting figure. Now leave that. So one of the events taking place, apart from the general strike to which we may also return, of course we must return. And their sociology, I'm afraid, was the occupation of the Odeon theater. So the theater here, which is in the center of the Quartier Latin, just behind us, one of the great classical stages, it was occupied by the students, and it became the stage, the site, I would say, for kind of permanent, uninterrupted political mass debate, if you like, something like that. So even longer than Cory Booker, but of course many more participants. We would have been quite well there. And so the great intellectuals, the writers, Marguerite Duras, Edgar Morin, I mean, not because they were great, because they wanted really to be part of the movement. It was called the movement. One after the other, they visited the kind of permanent General Assembly, revolutionary General Assembly at Odeon. So this, I don't know if you know the theater from the inside, probably not. It's big. It's a big classical theater. There is a stage, of course, and it was filled to the top with students booing or approving what was said. So Jean-Paul Sartre, the most famous of all French philosophers, the great old man, and the most radical as well in many respects, completely supporting the movement, of course, came to the Odeon and was asked to speak and say something. So at the very moment when Sartre was about to start, he's given a small little piece of paper like that, on which there was a single sentence. I have to say it in French, of course. Sartre, sois bref. And I can tell you, I've heard Sartre. He was worse than me. I mean, his measure, his minimum was an hour or two. So that was very true. Okay, so I've already eaten my time.
I won't
No,
straight.
I don't want to. Okay, so I will come to Rancière. I can put it not in a corner, in an important place. So I will not go into many details, but thinking about what I would possibly try and address as questions, I thought there should be at least 3 points that are worth discussing, taking into account. Now the first one has to do, of course, with the very object of your book, that is putting together the 2 sequences or series of events. The Prague Spring. So the official, yes, it's very simple. I mean, there's no discussion about that. It begins in January of '68, so it's the longest of the 2. It begins in January of '68, when after internal, you correct me if I'm wrong or if I simplify, Alexander Dubček, at the time the secretary of the Slovak Communist Party, he was a Slovak himself. I cannot speak about Dubček without emotion. That's So he was appointed or elected by the Central Committee or something like that of the ruling and only political party in the socialist state of Czechoslovakia. At the time it was state Czechoslovakia, one single country, but a federal country. So he was elected general secretary with a program of deep. We perhaps want later to talk a little more about that, but very fundamental reforms of the political regime and the economic regime, but the two things were totally impossible to separate from one another in this socialist republic, People's Republic of Czechoslovakia. Leave aside for the moment origins and of that, and then the end of the Prague Spring, the brutal end, the violent end, is August '68. If I'm not, which day? When the troops of the Warsaw Pact enter Czechoslovakia. Paratroops seized the capital city, etc., and very rapidly, not without resistance, but nevertheless with overwhelming force, and put an end to this experiment and reintegrate the Czechoslovak Republic into the Soviet system. These troops were Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, if I'm not wrong, and what is missing? Something is missing. German, of course. Not much. East German. Etc. So that's the Prague, the time span of the Prague Special. And as for the Paris events, they are of course shorter and of a very different style and content. They begin, well, there are preliminaries. One of the movements, students' movement, active in '68 is called Mouvement du 22 Mars. The leader has become a famous figure, Daniel Cohn-Bendit. They came from the University of Nanterre, which at the time was a very valiant place where the students were. And so the very origins are there, because students revolted against a kind of apparently very small or minor problem, but which quickly became a symbol and part of a broader protest against the at the same time, I would say, miserable and coercive or repressive manner in which the cité universitaire, what's the good English term for that, the pension, no, not the pension.
Dormitory?
Dormitories, yeah, were run. So the boys and girls were forbidden to meet, and they revolted against that. So it led to a series of students' strikes, occupations of academic buildings, and then in early May, one of them is brutally crushed by the police, and immediately after that, the whole student population in Paris and surrounding cities. After that, of course, it expanded to the so-called provinces. Decide on a general strike of the students, of course, and they demonstrate in the streets, and they are brutalized by the police. So on May 13, a huge demonstration was called to protest against this suppression. And here something crucial happens. The main workers were trade union at the time in France. It's no longer the case in quantitative terms, but that's another issue. The CGT, the CGT, very strongly controlled historically by the Communist Party, but not pure and simply a kind of a transmission belt. It's more complicated than that. Who had been involved for months and perhaps years in strikes and protests against both all the usual subjects, salaries, conditions of work, etc., etc. So they announced that they will join the demonstration organized by the students. And so this demonstration on May 13 is huge. And then, let me stop there, because, I do that. So then, of course, a general strike, as that time not a student strike, but a strike of workers in the factories, civil servants, teachers, everybody, in France. Of course, not everybody strikes, but it touches all sectors of the working society begins, which lasts until June, with several episodes. And that's where, of course, the initiatives that Jacques Rancière, and rightly so, particularly emphasizes self-government, artistic communities, creating for works of art for the whole population and so on. Okay. So that until the political leader of France at the time, General de Gaulle, a famous historical figure, who had contemplated several ways of reacting to that, including having the army that was particularly settled in Germany, come back to Paris, and so that would have been something like what took place in Prague, perhaps even worse. But he decided finally not to do it. But he succeeded in calling elections, and these elections, general elections, and these elections were a success for him. That is, for the government. So which essentially put an end to the movement. Although, of course, for some time you had factories here and there who tried to continue. Now, sorry, I'm getting much.
Maybe I can just post.
But, yes. No, so I thought we might, and I'll stop there. We might want to discuss three main questions. First, and I don't do it. First, what is the meaning of putting together, taking together these two events, apart from the fact that they are taking place more or less simultaneously, one of them and so several good commentators have insisted, particularly my dear friend Emmanuel Wallerstein, who is no longer with us, on the important, but he's not the only one, of course, on the important idea. He had two crucial ideas. First, 68 is a world event. So there's something to be understood there. There are movements in all parts of the world. So in a sense, it should not be limited to Prague and Paris. You'd have to add Mexico City, very, very. You'd have to add, since we talk about the Sorbonne, Columbia University in New York. That means something today, and so on and so on. So a world event. And the second, he connects that, combines that with the idea that, and that's something he has in common with Rancière. I always found that very, namely the idea that if we look for models or events in the previous history, in the past history, which somehow bear profound analogies with the spirit and the meaning of 68. Of course, the students in the streets of Paris were they put Mao Zedong's picture in the Sorbonne. They were full of they could recite Lenin's mottos by heart, and then etc. All the great revolutions. But the real prefiguration is 1848. And that's very interesting because the Prague Spring owes its name to the fact that it repeats somehow, in a certain sense, the famous Printemps des Peuples, the spring of the peoples from 1848. So you need to take all that. But my personal question is a question about Europe. I think that the object of of this book, or one of its main objects, is Europe. What is Europe politically and spiritually, and that's or intellectually, and that's something which today more than ever, of course, is an object of reflection for us. And so, what is remarkable is the fact that if you try and imagine boundaries of Europe, you can't. There are no external boundaries. Is Russia a part of Europe or not? Of course it is. But in another sense, it's fighting. Is America, North and South, part of Europe? Of course, in some very important cultural sense. So you cannot draw external boundaries. But on the other hand, something that throughout the 20th century, and perhaps even before, and today in a sense that continues, is the fact that there is a dividing line in the middle. Europe was made and remains made of two parts, which of course are not. Yes, you have to continue. So that's my first idea, if you like, that it has to do with, and of course the important thing is the fact that the differences are huge in a sense at each moment, but the affinities are in a sense even more important and remarkable than the differences. Then, and I stop. Then there is a second question to discuss, and that's where Rancière, of course, starts to play. That is, you speak of revolutions, revolutions for the future. That is, you decide, and that's a very meaningful decision, which I accept, but which I also find problematic. You decide to invert the dominant idea today, illustrated by a number of books, articles, etc., including very profound, serious works of theory. The most interesting formula, perhaps, is the one that was coined by the German historian and philosopher Reinhard Koselleck, Vergangene Zukunft, a future that entirely belongs to the past. That is, the way in which in the past we imagined, or our forefathers, etc., comrades in arms, etc., imagined the future. But now that's the past. So this is no longer the future, it's the future past. And your book is against that. It's against that. And I think that you are right, but of course that calls for a long discussion about what kind of actions took place in 68 on both sides. And the final point is I'm sorry, I'm terrible. The final point, just one sentence, is that when I opened this book, which is really beautiful, it's a work of art, I admire it, but I said to myself, it's not only a philosophical book. It's not even simply a book that regards, I would say, the articulation of philosophy, philosophical thinking, Badiou, Rancière, Deleuze, etc., with vital political issues, such no chance, not by chance, around the category revolution, which is one. But it's in a sense, it's a book that tries to incarnate, to embody something like a philosophical event, not just a discourse about the event, but something which is itself an event, and therefore, of course, draws our attention. And I also agree with. I don't know if I agree. Perhaps Chairman Badiou would say the same. Philosophy is not just a matter of writing, teaching, etc. But sometimes in history, or it's also a matter of acting. So, whole program of discussions.
Well, thank you so much, Etienne. I'm gonna try to run this more as a dialogue than a lecture, but it was really interesting. I want to say one remark, and I would maybe pass over to Vincent, who wrote actually a piece on May 68 from the perspective of our friends Deleuzians. I just want to say the title, as you said, The Revolutions for the Future. I think it was really linked to this idea that, sometimes the present is very obscure and we don't really understand the present. But maybe if we go to the past, to those forgotten sequences, we might find like potentialities in the past that could have been reivindicated for the present. So it's a bit like this kind of a Benjaminian, almost like back and forth. And for instance, our colleague for the Czechoslovak part of the book, our colleague Petr Kužel, wrote a very nice study of the workers' councils organizations in Czechoslovakia, which again was an attempt to create not only a political democracy, but also an economical democracy. Because as we know in the liberal regime, the whatever parliamentary democracy doesn't necessarily come with, the economic freedom and economic democracy. So he really writes very nicely about that in the Czechoslovak part of the book. I think there's a... yes?
No, I just wanted to say this book is perfect, it's beautiful, but it has one flaw. It's in English and not in French.
Well, maybe I'll translate it one day.
This is not a flaw, to be in English, but it's only in English, and it would be good if it were in French.
Well, maybe
perhaps in Czech.
it will be translated to Spanish, actually, not French.
Very good, excellent.
But
Okay,
maybe
sorry,
I want to
go
pass word to Vincent, if you want to react to something.
No, just a little thought about what Balibar said. It's interesting that Deleuze, Rancière, and Badiou don't use the term revolution. They use the term event. And I think it's one of the greatest effect of May 68 in philosophy. It's the replacement, maybe problematic, to the category of revolution, to the event. For Rancière, for instance, political creation is events, is not revolution. for Deleuze and Guattari too. It's the important fact is that something happened in history, something that is not the link of cause and effect, but a real event which can create future. But it's event from the future, from the French philosophy perspective, I think. But maybe it's also, and I know that you're more Marxist than me, and Balibar is Marxist too. It's the replacement of old Marxian revolution concepts to a more French theory, post-structuralist concept of politics of the event. So what do you think about
I would
that?
tell you what I come to my mind. No, I'm delighted that you raised this question, because I have somewhere, I have written some years ago a lengthy essay, painfully long, on May 68, which I start with something like. At the time, I probably understood nothing. Let's try and see if I can retrospectively. Let me do a little bit of advertisement. This was written at the request of a journal, an online journal, which I highly recommend to all of you, called Crisis and Critique. Many of us from different places regularly contribute. The two editors of this journal are Frank Ruda, who is German and teaches in Scotland, and Agon Hamza, who is Kosovar. He teaches in Pristina, so that's Europe. So in that essay, which I'm not going to summarize for you, I quote at the beginning a sentence from Deleuze. So don't ask me, I don't have the book with me, so Vincent, I can't give you the reference, etc. But I swear I did not invent it. And that's, yes, it's a piece relatively famous, I believe. Is it something like Mai 68 n'a pas eu lieu? N'a pas eu lieu.
I think you quoted in your
Yes,
paper.
in the two cents.
Yes, okay. And there, Deleuze says something, of course, very radical, not only radical and not radical, extreme, and therefore, of course, provocative. To my, I would not say that Deleuze eliminates or discards or rules out the category revolution. We might check. But what is sure is that Deleuze wants to get rid completely of the evolutionist, traditional Marxist, if you like. He's more Marxist than some people believe, but a representation. The one that was officialized, of course, in the socialist countries, the one that governed the ideology of the Soviet Revolution in October 1970, namely the idea that there is a process, which is also progress, the course of history, whose meaning essentially is that's the great eschatology, is to transform a class society into classless societies. And even if that's very difficult, all sorts of obstacles arise, etc., in the end it will prevail, provided, the great, etc., the force, the social force, the main actor, protagonist, called the proletariat, or the organized proletariat in the form of an organization, a revolutionary party, blah, 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 combines all the other elements, forces, and realizes, I would say, the transformation. So that, and the key category in this respect is transition. The revolution is perceived and theorized as a moment or process of transition between a before and an after. Now, leave the details, which are fascinating, of course. What Deleuze says is the revolutionary element in the revolution. So the essence, in a sense, of the revolution has nothing to do with transition, with moving from a past to a future. It's entirely contained in the invention or the creation of a new form of life. And Rancière has a wonderful formula for that. I heard him I don't know where he wrote it, but I heard him several times. He says, he presents it as a definition of communism. Communism is not the future state, etc. Communism is, he says, or writes, a community of life which at the same time is a community of struggle. So Deleuze is, I believe, close to that, but he has, I would say, an element of an affective element. So the revolution, and that's what he believed you could observe in 68. Now, so the actors, particularly the students, the Maoists, the Trotskyists, they were all completely obsessed with the Leninist or Leninist Maoist vision. So they said, we are starting the process, and after that we'll try and not betray the revolutionary ideals as the horrible Soviets did, etc., etc. But in practice, what they were doing, and not only the Maoists and the Trotskyists, should not focus on that. The population that was gathering here was inventing a revolutionary way of being together. So that's radically anti-capitalist or non-capitalist. And of course, I stopped, so I think that I quote Deleuze in my essay because I said that's a very important counter theory, if you like, or it's certainly not the Marxist, Leninist, Maoist tradition. It's the absolute opposite. It has to do with the intensity of the present. And it's etc. But of course, the two questions that immediately arise from there, and I stop is what makes this a kind of miracle, is also, of course, what could account for its completely short-lived. For its political figure. That's where Rancière's concept of the political is a concept that lives in the dreams. It's nothing to do with forces, social relations, relationships of domination, whether they can be transformed, reversed, etc., etc. It's as if, I don't say he believes that entirely, but it's as if the next step, if you like, the consequences were of no interest and no importance at all. And of course, since we discuss and we talk long after the event, we cannot, I believe, perhaps I'm wrong, but we cannot not ask the question, and then what arises from there. And the second question, this has, I would not say, it's not identical. I was not in Prague, of course, but that in every revolutionary moment you have actions and effects of creativity, collective creativity, communist moments, I would say, that combine, as Rancière would say, as Rimbaud famously said, changer la vie, change, and Marx, transformer le monde, transformer ça. So struggle and life, becoming different, I would say. So that's also there in Prague, although in different forms.
Yeah.
But then the other question that makes is that in France you have another movement. Not everything is taking place in the Quartier Latin. You have the factories, and so is it the case? Sorry to do some sociology. Is it the case that the workers incarnate or live or conceive or feel of their own movement, which I also see as something revolutionary, in the same manner as the students? That's the big problem. That's the big problem. The dualism of the May 68 events. And of course the young ultra, the young Maoists in particular, among whom I had many friends, they were completely imbued with the discourse which said, in the factories the workers are just waiting the moment when they will do the same as the students at the Sorbonne. And the reason why they are not, we cannot join forces and etc. Is just the fact that they are controlled by the old communist and socialist and CGT organizations. So let's try and break that armory, and the workers will become students.
Well, if I may just, so I wanted to address one thing. So your long dérive. Well, what's in this book? This kind of I would say it's a kind of a chiasmus, of
Absolutely.
like two elements of
Absolutely.
the Prague and Paris, if we want to be very Paris-centric, but let's say Czechoslovakia and France. This kind of a two situations. On the one side, the capitalist France. On the other side, the socialist, socialist Czechoslovakia. I was thinking about it, especially like rereading this book after a while, that there's a bit of a disjunction in that book, which is really interesting to explore, between the French thinkers who write, on Deleuze, on as I did on Badiou, actually exploring the concept of suture in Jacques-Alain Miller and Alain Badiou, which is also a quip on the name of the publishing houses, on the one side, and on the other side, the Czech thinkers, philosophers actually writing about the legacy of Czechoslovak Marxism. So, for instance, like in the French side, you have our Iranian friend Reza Naderi, actually discusses the theories of Sylvain Lazarus, according to whom politics emerges at a distance from a state. But on the one side, rereading the work of the Czech colleagues like Michal Hauser or Petr Kužel, I noticed that they kind of describe the events of '68, I mean in this case the Prague Spring, as kind of a politics within the party and the state, as a kind of dialectics between they say what Prague Spring brought up was a new form of mediation between the party state on the one side, the Communist Party, and the spontaneous politics on the other side. So in fact, like someone like Petr Kužel, who wrote this essay on workers' councils in Czechoslovakia, kind of begins his essay by criticizing what he sees as the one-sidedness of political philosophical theories, in which emancipatory struggles are always linked just with a certain form of anti-statism. And he writes about those workers' councils as a attempt to combine this economic and political democracy. In a way, it's kind of interesting comparing the Paris and Prague to notice that the relationship of the emancipatory movement to the state is actually quite different, and I think that's what we really get from the book when we reread it. What do you think, Étienne?
I think that I think that what makes the comparison interesting and relevant is the fact that you can find actually correspondences, analogies, similar inspirations, gestures, etc., taking place in two societies, types of societies and political regimes, which are so utterly and profoundly different and heterogeneous. So really, I mean, not going to resurrect theories of totalitarianism, etc., but Czechoslovakia under the party state domination is it's not a society where nothing takes place, where no discussions exist, where no initiatives of any sort. But the carcan, as we say in French, the limits, the armory, as I said a moment ago, is extremely tight. So the possibilities are so. Whereas France is a very different case. Of course, the movement confronts a state as well, police repression, etc., etc. That's interesting, but I tend to believe that we should avoid the all too well-known Marxist discourses on the essence of the state. You know, these are completely different types of states. Now, so what's interesting so then the second I conclude. The second idea that comes to my mind is it's important that you mention the workers' councils, etc. The workers' council is a political form which has varieties, but nevertheless very typical aspects which are more or less always the same. It forms throughout. It emerges perhaps in the 19th century, but above all, it forms throughout the 20th century the repressed side of the revolutionary idea and politics. So that without workers' councils, there's no Soviet revolution in October 17. And of course, they are there centrally wherever other attempts are made. Gramsci's Turin Consigli di Fabbrica, etc., etc. So periodic, this is the repressed side. And of course, the Soviet-type state does everything to. It would not have existed without this form, but it does everything to suppress it. And so it's very interesting to see it periodically return to the fore. So that's what famous formula whose origins I leave aside for the moment. I would call, it was one of our formulas in that time, the revolution within the revolution, la révolution dans la révolution. But or it's the return of the revolutionary element into the frozen and statist form. And that has to do, of course, I believe that this is with the fact that within the Prague Spring, I said the French 68 had different components. You cannot. I'm not trying to say that sociologically that the students are one world, and the workers are another. On the contrary, they intersect, they meet, etc. There's a beautiful book by Ludivine Bantigny on 68, which gives fascinating details about the discussions between students and workers in 68. So it's not something like a sociological divide, but there are two heterogeneous projects. And in Prague in 68, there's a socialist, there's a project of resurrecting, renewing socialism. And to resurrect or to socialism from within a state that presents itself as a socialist state, I would call that a communist perspective. And then, of course, there is a democratic, I might even say liberal component. So in your book, the preface that you co-wrote with Nick and Nesbitt and somebody else ends with a very radical dismissal and critique of what took place in 89, and you showed us your beautiful little poster, 89 reverses 68, so that's the betrayal, etc., etc. I'm not sure of that, and less given the situation in which we find ourselves today, and where a certain number of important liberal democratic elements and institutions are increasingly under threat, and therefore show how necessary they are. Now, of course, this liberal side triumphed in a sense, and the other one was eliminated. It was certainly already there, not in the form of, okay, leave the details. It was already there, and it combined, as always in European history, the element of public liberties, if you like, and the element of national autonomy. Never forget that the troops that invade Czechoslovakia in August 68 are the troops of the Warsaw Pact, and immediately after that, Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, officialized the doctrine of so-called limited sovereignty, for the souveraineté limitée for the members of the pact. So that's a very important.
Maybe I will have one more comment, and then we actually could open it to the audience, okay, because we don't want to keep you for too long, because you could lecture like this for the whole evening. But I just want to note, actually, regarding to what you just said, there's actually, many authors in the French part of the book, including Rancière, including, I guess, myself, Badiou, or Nick Nesbitt, and so on. They actually write about the fact how the French 68 was like a kind of a political practice whose goal was to suppress the mediations of the Marxist traditions, like, or to contest, maybe then suppress, like parties, syndicates, like all these organizations. It was kind of happening beyond them, and the movement kind of exceeded them. On the other side, like if I just mention this kind of a disjunction on the question of the state between the Czechoslovak and the French side, I think what you just actually mentioned also, I think the question which perhaps is not even sufficiently highlighted in the book, but we could think about, it's always which state, namely, what is the role, from a kind of dialectical materialist perspective, what is the role of the state in the society? And what by rereading those essays, what kind of orientation for political action can we get from that? Because if we, analyze, in fact, the situation of a communist or socialist, socialist state, many of the thinkers within those states saw the communist or socialist state as somehow reformable. You know, my colleague Michael Hauser actually mentions the fact that the Communist Party kind of reivindicated or renewed its legitimacy after, you know, the crisis and the tragedy of Stalinism, by claiming that it was them who somehow launched this process of democratization, which then they also couldn't totally master because, you know, the political process kind of exceeded them. So in fact, the emancipation or the event under the really existing socialism actually happens, you know, by kind of forcing the state, which at least on paper officially belongs to people, you know, to make him follow this, to make the state follow this doctrine. In a way, it's not against the state, but it's as if they wanted the state to be kind of true to its ideals. Whereas, you know,
were right.
Yeah. Whereas you know, if you think
They
of
were vanquished, they were defeated, they were...
I don't defend them. I just
I
structurally
defend them.
try
I
to.
defend them entirely.
Yeah,
Entirely.
I try to structurally explain how the movement or the events happens differently.
Yes.
Whereas if you look on the French side, you know, since it's a capitalist state, and you know, as we have read Marx and Engels, we know that the capitalist state kind of is a tool of the bourgeoisie, a tool of a class domination,
Blah,
a
blah,
primitive.
blah, blah, blah.
Oh, come on!
Yes, blah, 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 blah.
Primitive accumulation.
Yes,
Let me
yes,
finish
of course,
at least.
yes. That's such
That's
a
not
narrow...
very polite.
No, not you. It's not against you. It's not against you. It's not. It's against the Marxist
Yeah, but
narrative.
let me finish this
Yes,
sentence.
finish.
So since you know they saw the state under capitalism, you know, belongs to the bourgeoisie, well then the only strategy could be a revolutionary strategy, you know, is to be against the state. In a way, it would be naive to kind of think that we can reform the capitalist state, which until today, it's like the kind of, you know, problems that we see even in the United States with, you know, Bernie Sanders and so on. To what extent is the capitalist state actually reformable if we want to, you know, transform the situation? And so structurally, the role of the state and the role of the movement the relationship of the movement to the state on those two sides actually seems different.
But
No?
Yes, my dear, but it's
Yeah.
time. It's
Vincent
go ahead.
wants to say something.
I write it in my text on Deleuze, but the fact it is not against the people or the states. There's a new thought about institution, and you have a thinker like Frédéric Lordon who write think about institution books today, and it's not an institutional. It's not reformist, but it's like more like what Guattari do in Laborde. It's radically changing institution. An institution it's not the spontaneity of revolution, romantic spontaneity, but it's not also the global changing of society. And I think we talk about history, but what is new in French philosophy thought of event is that the change is not global, and revolution is a global effect. There is the phantasm of a global changing of all the entire global society. It's a problem too. While in Rancière it's really little effect, a multiplicity of real effect. But I think the problem of global change is the new one of the most interesting new idea about politics, but problematic too.
Well, maybe Étienne, we let you have the last word.
We don't.
And then we open to the audience.
Sorry,
Because
we have some
about
questions
the
here.
state, we could speak.
Can I ask
yes.
Vincent a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you just like, for the ignorant What's Chris Marker's take on May 68?
Ah.
Yeah, what's his vision like? Maybe we can get a different light.
His vision was that France was not. It was the last revolution, but the most mythical revolution. The French people kept the mythology of May 69 with the Ciné-Tract, with Godard, Marqueur, with l'École des Beaux-Arts. So it's the French invent a theory that Mai 68 is French, and it's not true. The Wallerstein said it's a world movement. Historians in France speak about les années 68, these 69 years, while it's a global event. It's not Parisian. Mai 68 is not French, it's not Parisian.
I actually never even thought about it as a French.
No, but you...
Yeah, but that's because we focus on a very small segment of history.
Italy is a fascinating case because the movement begins, in a sense, after the end of the French, and it takes very different forms. Where in particular, the great divide between the working class and the so-called new movements, the I wouldn't speak of students here. At the time, what was coined was the notion of anti-authoritarian movements, and these. And so, what's the target? The target are forms of power, and that's where Foucault, of course, is inevitable. But Deleuze and Guattari have their own.
It's a left-brain thing.
Sorry?
It's a left-brain thing. It's a non-cognitive revolution.
It's a non-cognitive revolution.
It's a revolution
What do you
against
mean
the
by that?
experience of oppression,
Yes.
not against an ideology.
Okay.
And we are now witnessing, I think, a revolution from the right against their experience of oppression, which has a lot in common with the experience of 68. It's just disgusting. But
That's a very important point. You know, I remember vividly a public controversy with my friend Jacques Nanterre, because we loved and his ideas are better. But it was not here, but it was not far from here in another bookstore, Compagnie, 2 blocks from here, 3 blocks. Immediately after he had published La Mésentente, which I believe the disagreement, which I believe is one of the major books of political philosophy in France, perhaps beyond, in that period. And then we started discussing about subjectivation, which is a central concept in his exam. And I objected, and I keep objecting. You seem to believe that subjectivation, perhaps invention of a community of life that is also a community of struggle, that's a good way of describing, is taking place only on the emancipatory side. And historically, that is not the case. That is not the case. Now, whether the what's their name? These bastards who invaded the capital in the US are very marginal people. But the organized fascist groups and troops that seized or helped to seize power in Europe in the mid 20th century, they were not marginal. They were not marginal, and their forms of their capacity, I would say, of subjectivation in that sense is amazing. So the basic phenomenon for me, and I'm not saying that Rancière completely ignores that. Deleuze and Guattari absolutely don't ignore that. It's a central issue for them. Is the ambivalence of collective subjectivation and mass movement and mass movements. I think that you raise a very if I don't misunderstand you, you raise an extremely important.
if I understand you, I agree completely with what you've just said, and unfortunately I must leave to.
Is there one more last question and then we have drinks?
And that means
Yeah, one last in the back and then drinks. And more questions by having drinks.
For me, the two frames that kind of came up, one was the whole question of Europe, what is Europe? But the question of Europe's others,
so much.
The question of what?
Europe's others
Oh, he doesn't.
weren't mentioned, which I
You're not
think
leaving.
has at least in the global south, the understanding of 68 is a kind of a belated return of what the Algerian and the sort of anti-colonial movement in the rest of the world was happening. So part of that. So I was wondering, A, what about Europe's other? And the second thing in that regard is to what extent we keep talking about, and this is what a problem I have with Badiou and others about the whole event, is that it was an event, but it was a belated event. And in that way it was misguided, because if you go back to Fanon in The Wretches of the Earth makes it very clear that the only way that the liberation of man, the revelation of humanity could happen if the working class in Europe works with the colonized, which never happened.
No.
And then you have the 68, which is in a way belated revolution that should have happened
Yes, I understand.
8 years. That's what I mean. It's a kind of a belated event, if you're going to talk about it. I was wondering what you, because I know your work, obviously, and you have written a lot about the.
No, I'm not able to entirely discuss that, but I would like to share with you kind of feeling, which perhaps, of course, is completely determined by the fact that others, Rancière, etc., we learned what politics means and what it is about in the framework of the colonial wars and the anti-colonial movements. So there were strikes. So that meant that in a sense, people like Fanon or Lumumba, I'm very much thinking of him these days, or Césaire, who wrote, etc., would show the way. They were our masters in a sense. But on the other hand, of course, you're right, the junction, the divide, the divide remained. So, and perhaps I'm risking this formula to the detriment of both sides, not just the North or the Northern. But then so again, what you know, for me, what was taking place in the factories in '68 is hugely important. You have to be critical, but you also have to understand. Georges Segui, who for me is a great man, he was the devil for the leftist students who saw him as has written in his memoirs, I justify our decision to negotiate an arrangement with the state at the end of the general strike by the fact that the situation was not revolutionary. And so that's what we need to discuss. But so for them, Mao was no idol or etc. But for the others, they wouldn't have been active in '68 if they had not been young students during the War of Algeria. And that's the formative experiment.
So, will be here. I think you can go to the bookshop, get the books. I'm sure Etienne would be very happy to sign some copies. Some copies of the book.
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And there will be drinks, and we're just here so you can ask formally questions around, and they'll be serving wine.